All right, so last week, we watched our film and finished. We had finished the book previously, but watched the film Field of Dreams. So, what are there any final thoughts? I had you do a little writing on some of the differences between the book and the film, particularly the characters that show up in the book that get removed or replaced in the film version. So, you guys responded to that. But any broader themes or any other character qualities, motifs, messages that are valuable enough that we want to kind of wrap up that unit before we go on to the next thing? Anything you particularly enjoyed or found meaningful from, especially the film, since that was the last thing we looked at? Okay. Yeah, I think, first, from I think what I've heard about it, the film, when they were adapting it, they had to come up with a different title because they were very nervous that anyone would ever go to a movie called Shoeless Joe. Books are a little more flexible. You're dealing with, oftentimes with books, an audience that kind of has other frames of reference, perhaps, historically speaking, whereas people go to the movies, that sounds cool, let's go to it. And so they thought, we need something that is more eye-catching, more interesting sounding. Regular people don't know what Shoeless Joe means, so no one's going to go to that movie. So they had to come up with something that sounded a little more magical, uplifting, and they came up with Field of Dreams, even though that phrase never appears in the book, obviously. They completely had to manufacture that. So you're right. We're trying to figure out, well, what were all these people's dreams? And for most of them, I think we can tell that it was something about youth. Either their childhood or their young adult life, where they had the potential for pursuing something they thought was valuable, and for whatever reason it just didn't come to fruition, either whether it was their fault or just the way things turned out. It was something they saw and they reached for and just never happened. And so for Eddie in the book, why baseball? Well, why do any of these guys pursue these sports? It's because look how you get treated. Look at the acclaim and recognition you get, rightfully or wrongfully, you might argue. That's not good to lift these people up in that way, but it is what it is. And if people are going to pursue something, you might say this is as good a dream as any for some people. In the movie Hoosiers, it was on TV the other night. It was up late. It's always on TV. And I'm from Indiana, so I watch it because that was a real story. I lived that out, that world. So there's a line in that movie where the one woman who's more skeptical of all the hype around basketball, she's like, I've never understood why the whole town goes so crazy for this, and just to be lifted on people's shoulders and treated like a god for 5 minutes. And the coach goes, anyone would give anything to be treated that way for just 5 minutes. Like, it's pretty powerful. And we might argue that sports isn't the best way to go about doing it, but we all have a need to be respected, to be loved, to be admired, whatever. And for some people, for Eddie, of course, he sort of presented that he was a real Cub, even though he barely played any minor league ball. He wasn't who he said he was, and he sort of lived this fib. And again, not that we should be living out a lie, but for some people, if that's what gives you acclaim and recognition, you'll tell minor fibs about yourself, even for 50 years, right? So why baseball? He would probably say, why not baseball, right? I think with the author in the book, it's Salinger. In the film, of course, Terrence Mann. They had to change that because J.D. Salinger wanted no part of ever having his name associated with anything. He was going to sue anyone who tried to use his name, and so they're like, forget it, we'll just rewrite a different character. It's back to that youth that he said, I would have loved to be on that field, just to play one time or whatever. And if that was his dream, okay, for everyone else's dream, it would be that he would keep writing because he was a great author. In real life, Salinger's a bit of an overrated author. His work isn't that great. His writing has become more mythologized and legendary because of his personality, his reclusive personality. His books and writings are mostly quite average. But, there are people who love it and would have liked him to write more. So it could be other people's dreams being put upon him, too. In the film, you're right, they play it up more that, oh, well, once I go to this weird place behind the cornfield, maybe I'll come back and write about it. And we're left with the question that, well, can you come back even? How does that work? I mean, yeah, is this like dying? Or is this just a magical place that you can visit and come back from? We don't quite know exactly. So yeah, the idea of, well, whose dreams are these really? And by the end of the film, we learn, at least from Shoeless Joe's final comment, that all along we might have thought the dream was of his dad to come back, and really it's presented that maybe the dream all along was for Ray to have his dad back. And so either one is very touching and emotional, but yeah, we sort of see Ray's dreams presented a couple different ways, both to see his heroes play again, but also, and to learn more about the tradition, but also to see his dad. So yeah, the idea of dreams and what those mean and how they connect to real life, it's very fuzzy and magical, like I said, but that's part of what makes it, I think, pretty fun. Oh yeah, he's assuming he would come back. He's assuming I could just go check it out and then come back. We don't know if it's like once you go there, you're now kind of a ghost like all the other ball players. Who knows? But
I like the little minor league kid. After he got the hit, he sacrificed being able to play to help the little girl.
Yeah, his dream was fulfilled. Right, he got to bat. Yeah, which is also something interesting that something this is wisdom, right? You can only know this later. You're exactly right and he even says it in the film, right? That he had thought his dream was to play in the big leagues and to get up to bat, and who knows, if he got a hit, he might have stayed in the big leagues. And only with the wisdom of hindsight does he say, no, actually my dream should have been to be a doctor, because look at all the people I helped, and I helped build this town and gained respect that way. You don't have to be an athlete to get respect and love from your town or from the people around you. And again, it's hard to know that when you're young and you're looking forward. It's way easier to go, oh, now that I'm older and I look back, this was actually the better path. So sometimes he got a taste of his dream, but he also got to remember that the dream he actually lived out was maybe even better, his actual life dream, which is kind of an interesting twist, right? Yeah, I think a couple things that I think are important that, we kind of mentioned it a little bit, but I wrote a quick thing about it last week too, that, we're always looking for, when we view films or books, are there, even if it's not explicitly a Christian or theological thing, are there things that are kind of similar that people write about or make films about that are almost so universally known on a subconscious level that they come out without maybe them even intending to. But for us, we recognize it immediately as the archetypal patterns of a biblical story. And I think this one has it, right? I mean, what's the message of the ending of that film? If you construct your life in a way that allows other people to feel redemption, to have a second chance, to be what they could be, and in the process of doing that, you aim at reconciling with your Father, you get to experience heaven. Well, yeah, that's exactly right. That's what we do as Christians. And so at the end, when he, the running joke is this heaven? No, it's Iowa. It's normal earth, right? And his dad says, man, I could have sworn it was heaven. And Ray looks around at his beautiful field, he sees his loving family, his home has been saved, sees his dad, he goes, yeah, maybe this is heaven. So is it real heaven? No, of course not. But for us on earth, where we're trying to experience a tiny slice of it, and that's how we should live, is what way could we honor our Father and honor and love each other in a way that creates a tiny version of heaven here? Well, he experiences it at the end. That's a pretty powerful thing. That's what we all should do. Reconcile with our Father, love those around us, help them be loved, and we get to experience a tiny piece of heaven. That's a pretty good story. So obviously they certainly wouldn't have had a theological aim at that. But again, these stories are so archetypal and so deeply mythologized and rooted in who we are that they come out, and for those of us who can notice it, we notice it immediately. It's great. I think the other thing, not on a spiritual level, but just on a practical sports level, that's so important, and why I had you watch that backstory on ESPN about Shoeless Joe, but also linking to Pete Rose, and it spills over to people like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens and these other guys who got caught with steroids and all that. The part of the film and the book that's very powerful for Ray and his dad, when we hear the backstory of his dad, is that the punishment was so severe. When you gamble, which is a form of cheating back then, you could say, just like steroids would be, the punishment is banishment. You're out. And we might think, well, that's so severe, especially with Shoeless Joe, because it was sort of found he didn't cheat really. He just took the money like all the other cheaters did, and he didn't do anything to ruin the game. He played very well. He played better than everyone else, and yet he was part of it. And so he's not in the Hall of Fame. Yeah.
That happened in real life. Someone was betting on the game. They're not supposed to.
Yeah, it just happened 2 weeks ago. That's right. Yeah, that idiot. He only was betting like $1,500. This dude makes $10 million a year, and he's betting $1,000. Like, that's like pennies. Why are you even doing that? But you're not supposed to bet on the games that you play in, right? Or the games going on right now. So the question then is, why is the punishment, whether it's gambling on your own games or using steroids or whatever the cause of cheating might be, why is it so severe when, as we've seen, there's horrible people in all these sports. There's people who have beaten their spouse, there's people who have drug addictions, there's people who commit assault or other felonies, and yet they get in the Hall of Fame. Why? What's your thought as to why some of the punishments are so severe when you think about what real crimes are, what Shoeless Joe did or what Barry Bonds did or whatever, they're not exactly the worst things in the world. So how come the punishment's so severe? Any thoughts? Yeah, but let's think of it this way. There's all sorts of rules, right? There's rules that govern little tiny components of each game. There are rules that govern how the sport functions that year or multiple years or whatever. People break rules all the time. If on the basketball court, if it's a physical game and you're getting frustrated and you stick out your leg and you trip a guy. Well, that's a foul. That's against the rule. You know it's against the rule, yet you did it anyway. The ref blows a whistle. You might even get teed up for it, for doing an intentionally harming someone. That is a form of cheating. You're trying to go around the rules to not let the guy run down the court. And yet, what's the punishment? At worst, it's a technical. Maybe you get ejected because you're viewed as starting a fight or something. But then you can play the next game. Like, it doesn't ban you from sports for the rest of your life. So people have these options all the time. They know what the rules are, whether it's something small like tripping somebody or whatever foul you commit. And yet, this one, similarly, they knew it's against the rules, yet the punishment is way more severe. Why? You're not only banned from the game, you're banned for life. from even not just the sport, but from even the Hall of Fame or the record books or anything. Like, you've been erased. You're gone. Why? Right. So there are differences in, we could say the line is a bit arbitrary, but still the intent is there, that there are differences in that in breaking the rules to try to gain an advantage, whatever that is, that doesn't necessarily harm the broader aspect of the game being played as such, or, you know, as an ongoing act. The idea of cheating is viewed as the strongest offense because it doesn't just undermine that game. It doesn't just harm that opponent. It starts to dismantle the entire structure of what it is we're trying to do here. When we try to play this sport, the sport only works if everyone tries something approximating their best, if everyone, for the most part, tries to follow the rules generally. And I think we talked about on the first day, if not, I've talked about in other classes, the goal is to always keep more games, having the ability for more games to keep occurring, right? The most important thing is not winning or losing. It's that you can keep playing more games. If we create a scenario, and cheating tends to do it, where you really can't keep playing the game anymore, because after all, if I already know who's going to win, and people aren't going to play their best because they're trying to throw the game or something, well then what's the point of even playing? The game itself then collapses. So the most serious affront to sport, and we could apply it to other things too, but in this case sport, is not the minor infraction in a specific instance. It's an undermining of the structure of the game itself, because it no longer is allowed to keep going. And so that's what's so egregious about cheating is, you know, it's not just, oh, I'm trying to defeat that opponent, or I'm trying to make a few bucks, or I'm trying to hit some more home runs by getting my, you know, putting steroids in my body. It's at a certain point, the game no longer is the game anymore. And the worst thing we can do in sport or otherwise is dismantle the game. The game is everything. It's not winning or losing. It's not becoming a hero. It's sustaining the game. And so that's why the punishment is so harsh. Now, I think some of these things could be reevaluated, perhaps. There's, you know, we can debate that. But if you are knowingly participating in a situation where you are causing some people to not give their best effort, then there's no reason to have a game anymore. So that's the ultimate no-no. And I think that's why the case of Shoeless Joe or Pete Rose or Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds, anyone else who's been convicted of cheating, that's why the punishment's so harsh. And again, it's sad because you could argue, did it really do that? Does it really matter if someone uses steroids? I don't know. I would say it matters if you bet on your own team to lose. Betting on your own team to win, does that matter? I don't know. You're trying to win, so you're not ruining the integrity of the game necessarily, but again, that could lead to other things too. So it is tricky, and I don't know if there's certainly not unanimous agreement about it, the punishment, but that's the intent behind it. And so when we think of other parts of our lives where keeping these structures up, the structures that hold civilization together, the worst crime that you can commit is anything that breaks down the structures that are trying to keep us afloat. That's the worst crime of all. You can't do that. So I think those are some real takeaways that I get from that movie and that book. Is there is a hint of a religious element to that story, and it also just clearly reminds us of the importance of not arbitrary rule following, but the disaster that true cheating and the disregard for the integrity of what it is we're trying to do here, whether it's sports, whether it's whatever else we live by, our justice system, our democracy, like you can't undermine those things because everything collapses and then it doesn't matter anymore and we can't live in that system. We have to have systems that we follow, right? That's what civilization is. So, is baseball the most important thing in the world? No, of course not. But it is indicative of other systems that we have to live by. So, something to think about. All right. Well, hopefully you liked it. I purposefully put that book and that film in the place I did because we just left off the previous week, 3 weeks ago now, with the lover archetype. And tonight we dive into the third archetype of our semester. And let me pull that up so we can talk about that. Okay, so again, we've been talking about archetypes. These are the ultimate models for kind of who we track through literature and their personalities and how they behave. And hopefully, I introduced at the beginning of this breakdown, this archetype study, but it's always the reminder that Christ is our ultimate archetype. He's the ultimate model who fulfills all of these qualities. So, how does Christ fulfill the warrior archetype? Well, he stood up to authorities that weren't living by God's word, and his warrior stance was to take the punishment for everyone else, not necessarily to fight back himself, but to accept the physical punishment for the sake of other people. And so that sacrifice as a warrior, that's how he exhibits that archetype. The lover, of course, he's the most compassionate, the most caring, the most respectful of life of any person or character we could ever think of. And so Christ is our ultimate model in that way. The third archetype of our semester, the Magician Archetype. So let's take a look at some of the examples of what this looks like. So this is our character in literature or in real life, if we're talking about some of our athletes here, who demonstrate reasoning, creativity, and the technical skill. This is, just like the other elements are already part of our inborn nature. Well, so is this. We as humans, we reason through things, we're creative and imaginative, and we can develop skills. That separates us pretty distinctly from other creatures on Earth. So this is already part of our nature. When we think of magicians in literature venues anyway, we think, well, Merlin, we looked at a little bit from the King Arthur legends. Of course, in Star Wars, Yoda, Obi-Wan Kenobi are these characters. Gandalf, of course. For David, King David in the Bible, Nathan sort of serves this purpose. He has special insight that David needs advice on. Mary Poppins would be someone like this. Of course, everyone in the Harry Potter world, they're all trying to figure out how to do magical things. In our real life, doctors, teachers, tech inventors, tradesmen, scientists, Einstein, Jonas Salk, these kinds of people, anyone who has these secret powers, this higher level of intelligence that are able to adapt to the world using their mind, especially. Of course, in literature and mythology, we see other special powers, but in the real world, this translates to our intelligence and our knowledge. We don't, this isn't the warrior who's using his body. This isn't the lover who's relying on emotions. This is someone using their mind and special knowledge of the world. We can see these characters, and they're very familiar to us, as, again, people have special insight. When we think of it in the real world, these are people who not only have advanced knowledge through study and all that stuff, but the way they're demonstrating it is usually what makes it stand apart. Because if you think of doctors and scientists, these are people who are seeing things in the world that regular people can't see, right? Think of a particle physicist. Like, they're looking at things that are practically invisible, and yet they can study it somehow. Or if you're a microbiologist or a a virologist, someone who's studying things that are smaller than cells even. You have to be very smart. You have to have access to that world that the rest of us clearly don't. So, these are people who are seeing things in the world differently than everyone else. And again, there's lots of ways to demonstrate that kind of knowledge. Something that's important with the magician archetype is this is the archetype that can regulate some of the other archetypes. This is what can help the warrior decide which things to go into battle about. This can help the lover archetype decide which things to become particularly emotional about. And so what Moore and Gillette talk about is, or the quote they use is, this is the archetype that can guide the process of transformation, both within and without. So this is part of something you were trying to do here at college, right? You're trying to gain special insight about the world with this advanced study called college, right? You're trying to transform yourself within by growing your intelligence, your creativity, your knowledge. The without part is, these are also the people that, like I mentioned here with teachers, can train other people to do it as well. So that's why, from an archetype standpoint, these people are so commonly the ones who guide the other characters towards becoming whoever they need to become. Yoda is Luke Skywalker's teacher, right? Gandalf is sort of the teacher of all the other characters in Lord of the Rings. He has the knowledge and the wisdom to guide the other characters. So this archetype, is a self-development archetype, but it's also a development of other people. You're trying to help other people grow, to become mature, to gain wisdom. That's why so many of these characters they tend to be teachers or mentors of some kind in stories and films. Remember, the warrior archetype, we're trying to figure out, well, the things they do, what's the ultimate point of their action? And for the warrior, remember, it was to protect civilization. Sometimes you got to fight about stuff, and that's what they do. And it was how life is protected. For the lover archetype, it was how life is enjoyed, because we enjoy the world and participate in our environment on an emotional level. For the magician archetype, this is how we understand things. We gotta acknowledge and try our best to understand what the world is doing in front of us. And of course, as Moore and Gillette say, this is the energy that drives modern civilization. Civilization is rooted in knowledge. You have to know stuff. You have to know how to plant crops and cure disease and build a skyscraper. Like, you have to know stuff if we're going to advance as a society. This is the character and the archetype that does that. All right. So there's defending society, there's enjoying society, and there's the knowledge of advancing society. So that's what, sort of distilling that chapter in Moore and Gillette, this is basically what we get. So, of course, when we're acting in fullness, remember that's the term those authors use, where we're reaching our highest potential in living out this character, you might say. So these are people, and what we're aiming at is to have awareness and insight and go beyond just common sense. We want to have that honed and developed intelligence. We want to use our knowledge to help others, not to use it selfishly. Again, that's why so often in literature, these are the people who are guiding the other people. They're trying to help advance knowledge. As I said, this is the archetype that tends to help the other archetypes a lot. The magician and the warrior often go together because it's hard. Ideally, you want one to influence the other. Sometimes the knowledge character, the smart character, needs to toughen up and to go defend himself, and so that person can draw on the warrior character. And of course, the warrior character, who's already tough, sometimes needs a little discernment and wisdom to know which battles to take on. So these two really help each other a lot. Oftentimes, these are characters that are more emotionally detached, as opposed to the lover, who is like your best friend, or they're upset, or they're kind of riding that roller coaster. This is the character that can stand back and reflect on what they see around them before becoming too rash and jumping into anything. Often very introverted, reflective. this is an important part of a personality trait we all need to develop is, yes, there is a time to become really emotional and attached to things. There's another time to step back and go, okay, I'm going to think about this for a bit. I'm not going to rush to judgment. I'm going to be more analytical, etc. These are people who are generally calm under pressure. Again, this is something that we need to do. You can't just rush into things all the time. You can harm yourself doing that. So we want to be someone people can rely on in a crisis because of the intelligence and the wisdom we have. And then lastly, depending on the story, this is something that some characters can access naturally. There are characters we see in literature who are sort of born with some special ability or some special intelligence. But also these are characters we often see who can develop it through practice. Again, that's why there's a teacher usually involved. So, Luke Skywalker, even though he's kind of born with the Force a little bit, and the mythology behind that changes as the series goes on, Yoda has to teach him. First Obi-Wan has to teach him, then Yoda has to teach him. Like you gotta learn how to do this. And so just like being a tradesman, there's a time of apprenticeship and learning the skills to do that type of job. In the end, you're doing something that hardly anyone else can do, so it's really valuable. And sometimes you can do it naturally, sometimes you had to be taught, but ultimately that's what separates you from other people. So that's something we all should aim at. Okay, so again, like always, there's always an opposing side to this, right? This is, again, being consistent. This is what's often called the shadow side of this archetype. We were living in fullness and being the best version of it previously. And again, if we were using Christ as our model, is Christ magical? Well, he has powers that no one else has. He can raise the dead and heal the blind and the sick, and he's God. He can do whatever he wants. So he does have special wisdom and special powers. But we also see in characters that go the opposite way that this is a big problem. Instead of being helpers, these are manipulators, right? They use their intelligence to harm people, to trick people, to take advantage of people, instead of to guide and mentor and teach. So these can be pretty dangerous characters. So we might think, again, we're seeing this in our culture now. If you notice, watch 5 minutes of the news every night. Teachers, scientists, propagandists, people who are seeking power and control rather than truth and being helpful. Gosh, some of the stuff going on in our public schools today, and private schools, frankly, especially at the lower levels, but even at universities. Like why are these teachers teaching these things? Well, it's not to help people, that's for sure. It's to it's usually for some sort of power or control. Scientists, when scientists manipulate data, they don't tell you the full story. They cheat on their experiments and their procedures of the scientific method. Like, these are people manipulating. This is not good. Because they're seeking power and control, these tend to be pretty arrogant people. They have the attitude that, well, I'm super smart. I know things you don't know, so you should just believe what I say. We hear that a lot from people. These are people who often are detached, but not in the good kind of reflective way. These are people who are detached in the, I'm smarter than you, and I don't need to help you. You're on your own because you're too stupid. So it's sort of an isolated by choice and an uncaring form of detachment rather than a observational, perhaps, form of attachment or detachment. And so ultimately, the little quote I liked that Moore and Gillette write is, whenever we use our knowledge as a weapon to belittle and control others or to bolster our status or wealth at others' expense. It's a pretty good summation of the manipulative side of this archetype. Which again, if Jesus wanted to, he could have just come and made himself the most powerful person, and he could have tricked people and used his mental abilities to persuade people to do whatever he wanted. But he didn't, because he's not living the manipulator side of the archetype, right? He's using the wisdom and loving side of the archetype. The other way is, even Moore and Gillette use this word, the dummy. they're nicer about it by calling this person the innocent. These are people. This is someone pretending to be smart. This is someone trying to slide by and have the appearance of having this archetype without putting in the work. This is the cheater, the plagiarist, the pretender. They want the knowledge, but they don't want to work for it. These are people who are pretty deceptive, and ultimately they're just avoiding responsibility, right? Because learning these things takes a lot of work, and if you just want the credit and have other people commend you for how smart you appear without actually being smart, you're playing the role of innocent. Ultimately, though, the innocent ends up being a manipulator too, because you're trying to fool people. So you're kind of both in this shadow version. So we can, if you know anything about big time famous books and films, you'll know that many stories are rooted in trying to battle this archetype. So think of, again, Star Wars. What do you think the Force is and the dark side? Luke Skywalker is trying to use his secret knowledge, his power, for good and not for being manipulative and power hungry. That's the whole point of the Star Wars, story. Of course, Harry Potter goes through the same thing. He's trying to learn how to use his magical powers. He's got teachers at Hogwarts who are helpful and trying to teach him the right way, and he's got some who are trying to get him to use his powers to either harm people or to become more powerful himself. So, again, teachers, mentors, these are the kinds of stories that are most common. An example I really love, let me just read it to you because it's really great. I actually think of this, I'm preparing some other lectures and work about literature in general, and this is such a great thing. It has to do with the science idea and the knowledge and intelligence idea, but it really goes to the purpose of why we study things like the arts and humanities. If you've seen the original Jurassic Park from 1993, there's a great scene. Jeff Goldblum plays Malcolm. He's the really bright scientist, and he's the one who's very skeptical of all this. He's a very cool character in the film, but in the book, the scene where he really expresses a lot of doubt about what Jurassic Park is doing. The scene in the book version by Michael Crichton is extended and actually goes into this problem even deeper. And so in the film, the line is there, but it's expanded in the book. And the great line that I love for literature is, your scientists were so preoccupied with what they could do, with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should. So, the idea of should you do something versus whether you could do something, well, now we're getting science is what can you do. How do I know what I should do? Well, now we're in the realm of the arts and literature, theology, philosophy. Like, you need both. You can't just be a scientific mind. You'll expand your knowledge if you're more than just a literary or an artistic person. You kind of need both to live in this world. And again, the film, it's like a 3 or 4 minute scene. It's quite short where they go into this. But in the book, notice how he really criticizes this, what would you say, lack of foresight, lack of awareness of the potential problems of what they're doing when they build Jurassic Park, all right? So the main doctor, if you remember from the film, Hammond, he says, the raptors got out. At this point, Malcolm has been injured because the dinosaurs are on the loose. And Malcolm goes, oh, did they? He's always the sarcastic one in the film and the book. How could that possibly happen? It was a system screw-up. Arnold didn't realize the auxiliary power was on and the fences cut out. Again, Malcolm goes, oh, really, did they? He calls him a bad word. If I remember, Malcolm said, I predicted defense integrity would fail. Hammond sighed and sat down heavily. It must surely not have escaped your notice that at heart what we are attempting here is an extremely simple ideal. My colleagues and I determined several years ago that it was possible to clone the DNA of an extinct animal and to grow it. That seemed to us a wonderful idea. It was a kind of time travel, the only time travel in the world. Bring them back alive, so to speak. And since it was so exciting and since it was possible to do it, we decided to go forward. We got this island and we proceeded. It was all very simple. Simple, Malcolm said. Somehow he found the energy to sit up in the bed. Simple. You're a bigger fool than I thought you were, and I thought you were a substantial fool. Ellie, one of the other nurse or scientists, says, Dr. Malcolm, and tried to ease him back down, but Malcolm would have none of it. He pointed to the radio, the shouts and the cries. What is that going on out there, he said. That's your simple idea. Simple. You create new life forms about which you know nothing at all. Your Dr. Wu doesn't even know the names of these things he's creating. He can't be bothered with such details as what this thing is called, let alone what it is. You create many of them in a very short time. You never learn anything about them, yet you expect them to do your bidding because you made them, and you think therefore you own them. You forget they are alive. They have intelligence of their own. They may not do your bidding, and you forget how little you know about them, how incompetent you are to do the things that you so frivolously call simple. He sank back in his chair. Malcolm continues, you know what's wrong with scientific power? It's a form of inherited wealth. And you know what jerks congenitally rich people are. It never fails. Hammond said, what's he talking about? Harding made a sign indicating delirium. Malcolm cocked his eye. I'll tell you what I'm talking about. Most kinds of power require a substantial sacrifice by whoever wants the power. There's an apprenticeship, a discipline lasting many years. Whatever kind of power you want, president of the company, black belt in karate, spiritual guru, whatever it is you seek, you have to put in the time, the practice, the effort. You must give up a lot to get it. It has to be very important to you. And once you've attained it, it's your power. It can't be given away. It resides in you. It's literally the result of your discipline. Now, what's interesting about this process is that by the time someone has acquired the ability to kill with his bare hands, he's also matured to the point where he won't use it unwisely. So that kind of power has a built-in control. The discipline of getting the power changes you so that you won't abuse it. But scientific power is like inherited wealth, attained without discipline. You read what others have done and you take the next step. You can do it very young, you can make progress very fast. There's no discipline lasting many decades, no mastery. Old scientists are ignored. There's no humility before nature. There's only a get-rich-quick, make-a-name-for-yourself fast philosophy. Cheat, lie, falsify, doesn't matter. Not to you, your colleagues. No one will criticize you. No one has any standards. They're all trying to do the same thing, to do something big and do it fast. Because you can stand on the shoulders of giants, you can accomplish something quickly. You don't even know exactly what you've done, but already you've reported it, patented it, sold it. And the buyer will have even less discipline than you. The buyer simply purchases the power like any commodity. The buyer doesn't even conceive that any discipline might be necessary. Hammond said, do you know what he's talking about? Ellie nodded. I haven't a clue, Hammond said. I'll make it simple, Malcolm said. A karate master does not kill people with his bare hands. The person who kills is the person who has no discipline, no restraint, and who has purchased his power in the form of a Saturday night special. It's a type of gun. And that is the kind of power that science fosters and permits. And that's why you think that to build a place like this is simple. It was simple, Hammond insisted. Then why did it go wrong? So again, that scene it's only a small piece in the film, but it's really important because these are people who have magical powers, right? They're scientists. They see things that other people can't see. They've studied for a while, for a time, and yet they haven't thought enough about it to understand the consequences of their actions. They're in it for power, for wealth, whatever their incentive is. And of course, in the film and the book Jurassic Park, it goes horribly wrong because the dinosaurs are running wild, right? So the same thing happens in Frankenstein, one of my favorite books. The point of that, well, one of the points of that book, there are a couple of really important ones, is that Victor Frankenstein is a scientist. He thinks he's going to change the world. He can bring people back to life. He can reanimate dead tissue. Sounds simple. Now, he's a very smart guy. He's been studying chemistry and all these things at university. And he thinks, I figured it out. This is going to be great. I'm going to become famous and everyone's going to know my name. Well, as we all know, even if you've never read the book, that goes horribly wrong. And the monster, kind of like Jurassic Park, breaks free and causes all these problems. And so it's the assumption that someone with this great insight, this great power, intelligent power, thinks, I have all the answers. Anything I create is going to be positive. There's no downside to this. It's going to be great. That is not the proper respect for the world and your intelligence, and that can be disastrous. It can destroy the world. So this is something that theorist Neil Postman talks a lot about is anytime you're going to think about any new technology, you have to always consider the consequences because it could go wrong. And if you haven't thought about that, then we shouldn't use it. We wonder if when Mark Zuckerberg invented Facebook, if he thought, this is going to be great, everyone's going to love it, there's no downside. Little did he know that there's about 100 downsides to it, and it's disintegrating most of our culture because of what social media does. Like, did you think about that? Probably not. And now we have all sorts of problems with social media. So this idea of knowledge and intelligence and how to use it properly, this is the archetype that we're talking about here. And this is yet another side of our personalities that we need to develop, but we need to develop it very carefully, of course. So that is the magician archetype. So we've done warrior, lover, now magician. That leaves us one left.